Before we start, if you're enjoying these conversations, please make sure that you like or subscribe to Cleaning Up. It really helps other people to find us. Cleaning Up is brought to you by the Liebreich Foundation and the Gilardini Foundation. Hello, I'm Michael Liebreich and this is Cleaning Up. My guest today is Emma Pinchbeck. She's the CEO of Energy UK, the industry trade association, and before that she was Deputy CEO of Renewables UK. Please welcome Emma Pinchbeck to Cleaning Up. Emma, welcome to Cleaning Up.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for making time. What I'd like to do, if we could start with you just explaining to our audience what it is that Energy UK does, because obviously, I would say all of our audience, I'm sure, knows, but you might want to remind them they are an international audience.
They are way ahead of me if they know what Energy UK does. No, we're the trade body for the energy industry in the UK. So we have a variety of roles. We bring industry together to solve policy problems, to conduct advocacy campaigns with government, to network, so often to do kind of commercial deals or talk to each other about issues in the sector. We hold events and we're the spokespeople, I suppose, for the sector in the media. The range of members we've got is quite big, and unusually for a trade body we have both retail and generation, so infrastructure, but also the folks selling the products and services to consumers. We don't have upstream oil and gas production, and we don't have our district network operators, many of them, but we have almost everything else, from EV charge points through to the biggest energy retailers. So it's a good gig, and trying to get consensus on policy is difficult, but when we get it right, there's such power behind that because of the breadth of the sector.
And the sector, though, from what you've just said, it's not just the electricity sector. So we had Christian Ruby, who is the president or CEO of Eurelectric.
Yeah.
That's everything, but it has to be electric. Whereas you go across the traditional, the fossil and other sectors as well.
Yeah, we go across the lot. So I've got a bit of everything, and I suppose that's interesting in the context of how I was appointed, because my background is decarbonisation, and so that in the UK means a substantial amount of electrification and a big shift away from fossil in general. And they wanted me as chief exec partly because of that expertise, and so I speak for the gas generators when I'm talking about gas transition, which is something that the folks who troll me on Twitter about gas should remember, that we are that broad voice. And I think that's quite remarkable that we've got that consensus on net zero, given that we're not just the electricity generators or not just working on electricity.
That must cause some quite interesting conversations amongst your members, though, because their interests are not all always aligned.
Well, yes and no, and I'm sure we'll come on to this. I think the critical thing that's changed over the last 5 to 10 years, certainly since I've been working, is it feels like the energy transition has gone from being driven by climate policy, so kind of driving out fossil fuels because of the need to decarbonise, to something where, yes, there's still altruism involved for industry, but actually the money is firmly on the side of these new technologies. So actually, most of my members agree where the energy transition is going and are either transforming their businesses or getting into new businesses to do exactly that. So there's no real disagreement about what 2040 looks like. There's sometimes disagreements about the exact roadmap or the exact commercial model, but everyone will tell you that what the 2040 UK energy mix looks like, more or less. And that's a really straightforward thing then to work back to what we need for the next 5 years or the next 10 years of energy policy. And in that sense, I know Christian very well. He and I don't disagree that often about what energy policy looks like, even though his members are a narrower range than mine.
Right now, I think we're going to come back to some of these questions, because that's all very sort of that's very diplomatic. But you do have members who are simply threatened by all of the transition, presumably, who are really not sort of involved on the net zero technologies. But let's come back to that, and you may be able to maintain the diplomatic response. I may be able to sort of get you to admit that there is a bit of tension. But the 2040 is a great sort of jumping off point for a really, really important topic at the moment. We are, as we record this, on day 12 of this Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it is roiling the energy markets. There's also, the European gas prices are at an enormous record. I mean, they're pretty much an order of magnitude higher than they've been for the last 20 years. And we're starting to see statements out of even, especially Germany, that has been, has allowed itself to become very dependent on Russian gas. And there's been more movement on German energy policy and discussion in the last week than I've seen in probably 20 years. But the question is to you, what are the long-term implications? Because that's today. But does 2040 now change because of Ukraine, or will everybody forget it? And, what are the implications also for the UK in particular?
So if the UK was a standalone market, which of course it isn't, we are ahead of the curve in the sense that the plan for the UK was to reduce our dependence on gas, was to primarily actually the focus of the next 10 years really get off gas in our homes. The UK burns a lot of gas in homes, and that's where a lot of our exposure is, the gas market. And on the power sector, really invest in hydrogen, carbon capture and gas transition there. And so, both in terms of the reliance on gas overall, but also Russian gas, which is a very small amount of what we import. There was a plan, and we just have to execute the plan and do it as well as possible. I think there are going to be some significant market consequences because other European countries are likely to speed up. So it's not a problem on my list for right now. Right now, it's what do we do about energy bills in October? How do we get the industry through this really challenging period? But I have said to government, what happens when Germany's got a 2035 target now for 100% renewables? Sounds really challenging. But what that means they'll have to do is hugely up their investment and go after all the jobs and skills and supply chain companies that we want in the UK to do the same thing here. So I do wonder whether to protect what we were already going to do, we need to go faster because other markets are going to be competing for the skilled workforce, the products that we need to do that change. There's another long-term impact that I'm particularly worried about in the UK, which is to do with retail. Our retail industry is very fragile. That's where we've seen the impact of high gas prices to date, actually. And the retailers have got some of the most exciting, innovative propositions for changing customers' homes in the UK. And in fact, I think they could be the thing we've been missing to date on our home energy efficiency and heating. I'm worried about what happens if our retail market isn't sustainable, or we lose players and there's less competition and they're not able to innovate. And that would have really big long-term consequences as well, because heat is a major challenge in the UK. So there's those kinds of things percolating away. Honestly, Michael, I think there's a lot of speculation at the moment, very little informed contribution. And I think wise people are trying to manage the immediate crisis, and then I've got like a kind of long list of medium risks and long-term risks that change about every 24 hours at the moment.
Right. In fact, I've jumped over the near term, and in fact, maybe we should have started the other way around.
Yeah.
But if I paraphrase that sort of 2040, what you're really saying is that this will accelerate a transition.
Yeah, no question.
A number of countries that are finally going to sort of get much more serious and much nearer term, and then which is sort of good from a climate perspective, potentially threatening from a jobs and supply chain perspective. But if we talk about that near term. I wrote a piece which on LinkedIn about how, if we really wanted to be serious about sanctions, we would stop buying Russian oil and gas.
Yeah.
And I don't see how we do that without very substantial disruption and behavior change and so on. I mean, we're not going to be able to pretend that nothing's happening domestically if we do that. But is that a conversation that you're involved in?
Yeah, I mean, it's on the list, right? So the really complex thing for industry at the moment is they're balancing a number of what I would call moral need. So folks who can get out of contracts are doing it. We're seeing it already. So there aren't that many players that have long-term gas contracts with the Russians in the UK, but a lot of the market has already divested where it can. There are some really complex moral questions though about, for example, generators who are active not just in the UK but across Europe, who have gas contracts that are basically underpinning economies that you do not want to become fragile in the context of Russian aggression, and or supplying what is an essential service and energy that could cause real public opposition if you cut it off, or much higher bills, and bills are already at levels that we're worried about cost of living in many markets. And so the industry is trying to weigh divestment, where it's in control of that, against those other things that it has to do. Someone said to me, as you say, to put sanctions on or to really divest of Russian gas feels like the right thing to do in the context of Ukraine. To explain that and the consequences of that to publics across Europe, you would probably need the public to really understand the Russian invasion is just so horrendous, so grotesque, that they are willing to take higher energy bills, face disruption in their economies and everything else to cause that pain to Russia. And that is a political question that the industry is not in control of, really. That's about how do you talk to the public about the right thing to do and make sure they come with you if we do that. On the medium to long term, yeah, we're very lucky in the UK that we're not as exposed to Russian gas as we could be, but you're absolutely right that everyone's going to try and get out of it as fast as possible.
It's you know, I'm hoping, because this interview will come out in about 2 weeks from when it's filmed. That's how long it normally takes, and we don't know how this is all going to play out. I sincerely hope that it has not got to the point where it is abundantly clear to everybody that the highest priority thing is instantly shutting off those taps. Having said that, I'm finding it completely surreal, because I think we're at that point already. I think that what is going on is already sufficiently horrendous to take very dramatic action. And meanwhile, there's this surreal aspect to this, which is that we Europe, not so much the UK, but Europe is still buying Russian gas, which is flowing through Ukraine.
Yeah.
And that is still going on today. And there's a certain amount of sort of self-censorship and people, stopping buying Russian oil, which is much more voluntary and lower, shorter term contracts. But, how can it make sense to be, what sort of world do we live in where we're buying Russian gas? We think that just removing Netflix from Russia is going to somehow sort of bring them to their knees whilst we still buy their gas. It just seems extraordinary.
Yeah, it highlights so good things that may come out of this, though there's not much good about it at the moment. I think it highlights the volatility, the geopolitical complexity of fossil fuels, and how international that market is, and how little, Western governments are really in control of it. And it's a nice bit of, there's a lot of hindsight thinking going on about, well, how did we get into the situation and we should have gotten out of it. I agree with that kind of flow through of gas. Why are people still buying it? Well, because they're dependent on it. And those economies, particularly in Eastern Europe, where the LNG infrastructure is not as good, they don't have many alternatives. And there is that weighing up being done, I would imagine, by politicians. For the industry, they're going to stand by whatever sanctions the government puts forward. They've said that. And you can see the traders already pricing in the risk of additional sanctions. That's partly why the price is so sky high this week. So, industry is going to do whatever governments want to do, and fundamentally wants to do the right thing. It just is just a pretty horrendous situation, as you say. And I agree with you. I think you look at it and think, what are we all doing? In the long run, the folks arguing to stay on gas or do more gas or that being the solution to what's going on baffle me, because it's obviously not that. And most European governments are going to do all they can to get out of Russian gas in the long run.
Right, and we'll get on to the people, the voices calling for more gas. But in terms of a short-term reduction of gas use, it just seems, I draw the parallel with how Japan responded after Fukushima. all of the nuclear power stations were taken offline, and everybody was expecting power cuts, and there weren't any. And there weren't any because politicians, industry, consumers understood how important it was to reduce demand. And this debate has almost not happened in the UK. And I don't think it's happened in most of Europe, or in fact, to the extent that LNG cargoes are global, are traded globally, it just feels to me like we are, that we probably can't, we can't get off Russian gas fully without enormous disruption, but we ought to take a huge bite out of it relatively easily, I believe.
So I think there are two things there. Firstly, a lot of people are saying to me, why is the UK government not prioritising a big consumer messaging campaign? So in the UK, a lot of our exposure to gas is on heat and on domestic heating in particular. So why not be talking to people about turning down the flow temps on their boilers, which I know is like very niche, but it would make a big difference.
I smile because I don't know if you know, but that's been one of, I don't want to say it's one of my campaigns. It's not. Yeah. There are some extremely good engineers who have been talking about it and I actually had Nathan Gambling on this show.
Nathan Gambling.
Exactly, with that Beta Talk, his podcast. But there are a lot of very, very smart engineers that have been absolutely banging their head against the wall, trying to get the message about lower flow temperatures. Because people think of reducing your heating bills. Oh, well, you have to be cold. And yes, running the thermostats a bit colder would certainly help. But you can reduce the flow temperatures. Between the two, we ought to be able to cut our gas demand by 10-15%.
Yeah.
And by the way, we've also got lots of empty offices because people are working from home, and I bet we're heating them all.
Yeah, that kind of thing. So why is that not a message going out? So there's a lot of focus on production because that's how simple analysis tends to enter the energy market, but very little on demand reduction.
So here's my question to you. You've said, oh, well, my members will do whatever the government tells them to do.
Yeah.
Are you camping in front of number 10 saying, we can immediately cut gas use by 15%. We need your help to communicate, but here's how you do it.
Yes. So short answer, yes, we have been asking for them to focus on that. But the reason that we think it's a government lead, or at least not just an industry lead, and this is with affection for my members, the folks who can do that best are the retailers, the people we pay our bills to. The retailers are not usually the most trusted on energy bills. And at the moment in the UK, where energy bills are very, very high and retail has been unstable, there is a risk that when your supplier writes to you and says, your energy bill is really high, or to deal with the situation in Ukraine, why don't you turn your boiler down, that it looks glib or doesn't recognise how people feel about the retailers. So we think it's a government lead with the industry supporting, but the industry has been saying that, yeah.
But let me push you on that, because frankly, the industry has been promoting high boiler temperatures. The boiler bit of the industry, I don't know, are the boiler?
Oh yeah, they're not in my membership, so let's.
They're not in your membership. Oh, that's good, because we can dump on them. Because it is incredible to me that these big companies that make boilers have, and you can go today, you could go on the internet and you could see their instructions for setting up a boiler and the rest of it. None of them talk about keeping the flow.
Yeah, mine said I had to run mine at 70. I did mine last week, and right. And it's a new boiler, something else that triggers bits of the internet, because I've got a boiler in my house. The manual said that I should be looking to run the flow temperature at 70. I was like, in what world? And of course, and then it had a little side note to say if you've got underfloor heating, you can run it at 45. And the reason is they're assuming an ambient high efficiency system if you've got underfloor heating. But you can run my house is very energy efficient. It's got brand new radiators in. It's basically heat pump ready, my house. And so I can run my boiler at sort of 45, 50. I've been trying it through the winter at different patches, and it's fine.
Right. And, our housing stock was very poorly insulated 20 years ago, but it's actually much better now. And I think that, we have a law that says we have to install condensing boilers, and they do not condense if you've got flow.
Exactly that. They're actually inefficient. Yeah. I know. Yeah. So the guy for my boiler is requiring me to run my boiler inefficiently. And luckily I know the industry, so I wasn't particularly frightened about adjusting it. But for a lot of people, that is very frightening. They're going to stick to what's in the manual. Anyway.
But
my bit of the industry very up for a campaign.
Right, but I want to come back to you. You dodged, well, between us, we're allowing you to dodge. The question is that the retailers are the ones who could come in, they could send engineers in, they could run a proper campaign, which is going to require visits to houses to adjust your heating to help people. Because what you need to do is you turn down the flow temperature, but you need to then adjust the time which the heating is on for. So you can't just heat it with an hour here and an hour there. You're going to run it, but it's going to be cheaper. The retailers are not trusted because they don't do that sort of thing, surely.
I don't know. I mean, I think some of them do it and do it well, but they tend to be newer brands that can. So, and some of them have already, actually. I know Activism and Novo have done that sort of scheme, for example. I haven't actually spoken to the ones with really big installer fleets and asked what they're planning on doing, but most of them are thinking about consumer comms. They do tend to get smacked for it when they do this kind of thing, though, and I will tell you that if there will be nervousness around it without some kind of government lead. But I think they all acknowledge that it would be the right thing to do. Similarly, the other reason, Michael, and the thing that we are again maybe dodging, is that most of them right now will either be focused on, how the hell do we stay in business with prices this high? But secondly, a lot of customers are just, it's just, they've got to get through talking to them about why their bills are going up. You know, just the call volumes we've got going into call centres at the moment are 5 to 10 times higher than they normally be this kind of year. They've got a lot of vulnerable customers to help. You know, they've got limited resources because of the market. So I think it often feels like, what's the right thing to focus on first?
Well, so I mean, and I'm just listening to this going, well, the people are already calling, asking for the solution, which is turn down your thermostat a bit and adjust your flow temperature. And if you need it, we'll send an engineer, should be the response. And if anybody from Ofgem is listening, or from government, and these retailers are saying, well, we can't do it because we're a bit worried we might run into a bit of a regulatory brick wall, that has to be the sort of thing that Energy UK could help to fix, no?
Yeah, it is, and it's on the list of things that we're looking at doing. I mean, I think, just back to your point though, I think most of them, if they said that to someone in a call centre, for most of the people calling, they'd be like, it's a bit like the government help that came out, the 200, 300 quid. For some customers, that's generous enough that they're giving it back. For the people that really need it, who are the kinds of people that phone call centres, none of these interventions are going to be enough now, and particularly not with the prices we're seeing. So there's that kind of, there's a lot to do to get that right, but it should certainly be part of what we're saying to people. I'm violently agreeing. I mean, coming back to why I think it shouldn't necessarily be retailers, it's just that's a comms instinct on who we have seen people, particularly vulnerable people, trust. And I think there's a kind of acknowledgement in industry that we're not always the right people for those kinds of messages, that sometimes you do need to do it in partnership with consumer groups or government or others.
Right. And one final point, the problem with doing it from government is the government is packed full of very, very wonderful and very brilliant people.
Who also can't communicate.
They tend to be PPE grads from Oxford. And so if you expect them to create really detailed regulations around flow temperatures or around,
they over-engineer. Yeah.
Well, they over-engineer, or they just get it wrong and tell everybody to have piece of kit X, as opposed to. But anyway, we should move on from that, because I've given you a bit of a hard time, and hopefully that by the time this episode comes out, there'll probably be all sorts of initiatives. But you're right, of course, it has to be done in coordination with government, because it should be, TV advertising where people, encourage.
Well, that's the kind of thing I'm thinking of. That kind of campaign where you see it. Yeah.
But let's talk about the people who sort of say, oh, listen to those two wittering on about, and they're going to be talking about heat pumps for the rest of it. I can't bear this, because the answer is so obviously gas.
Yes.
And the reason we've got a problem is because it's people like Emma and people like Michael who haven't let us, although, to be honest, I was actually in favor of fracking well regulated.
Oh, were you?
Oh, yes. But it's people like us, or it's the Green Blob or whoever, who have failed to, or blocked the UK from sorting out the supply side, which is the only possible answer to this. So what do you say to them?
Well, it's wrong. So let's just start there. So there's no issue with the supply of gas. It's not a production problem that's causing these prices. And even if it were, unless they're planning to nationalise the industry, which curiously I don't ever hear these guys calling for. It's not let's nationalise the shell industry and somehow target the profits that way, or let's tax it really, really heavily and, I don't know, hypothecate the profits to something like green measures, which would make a difference to bills. There's no link between increased production here and bill reduction, right? So
but
that's... Go on.
Let's explore that, because what they're saying is that, look at America, it's flooded with gas. Gas prices are cheap because they've got so much of it. We've got the gas, right? We've done the geology. It is underground. We should be flooding the market with gas. And that would be the best way to help householders, because they'd have cheap gas. Flood the market. Forget nationalizing whatever. Of course, we're not talking about that, because we'll just flood the market and make it cheap.
So I think the maximum, like by the industry's own estimates, the maximum they thought they could get out of Bowland Shell was enough to meet about 5% of UK gas demand. And that was after 10 years of ramp up. So getting the sites right, assuming that they get every planning application improved, they don't face public opposition. Of course, it's a fact in the UK that the public hate it. So that's a challenge. It's one of the genuine obstacles to getting the development away in the UK. On top of which, unlikely every planning application will succeed, because unlike in the US, we're much more populated where the shale is, so it's difficult to extract it, but then also to move it and get the infrastructure around it. So there's loads of reasons to think that 5% figure is toppy anyway, and that's in 10 years' time after you've managed to scale up the industry. I mean, you can go faster. We've seen technology transitions go faster when you want, but it's not going to be the solution to today. So that's the first thing. Second thing I'd say is, I was working on shale in 2015, and what was said to me at the time is they can't get the volume out of the ground at a price that's high enough to make it worth doing, so investors are not going to touch it. And by the time they do, renewables will be so obviously a more attractive investment that you'll go that way. And that proved to be absolutely true. And at the time, a lot of smart economists made fun of me when I was giving evidence to the select committee that said that. But in short, it's been a market failure. So I just don't think you would ever get it away at the scale and volume that you need, and then be able to target it enough to make a big difference on either security of supply or prices. So everyone in the sector has been clear on that. And, you know, I think, again, coming back to previous conversations, so much focus on production. It's the energy economics of like 1974, where actually demand feels like it's the thing. And anyway, even if you're looking at production and resilience and security of supply and kind of big kit, you're going to do renewables, not gas now. That's the way it's going to be, and the complementary technologies around it.
Right. But again, I could push back and say, well, you know, the only reason economically it hasn't made sense is because you have to stop drilling when there's a, 0.5.
Oh, yeah, the limits are tight in the UK.
Well, 0.5 is like somebody sitting heavily on a chair in the next room. I mean, and then they have to stop drilling and fill in all these reports and so on. And of course, you can't make money like that. So is there any merit to the argument that that this could be even 5% is not nothing, right?
Yeah, but it's still only 5%. And by the time you prove that, I mean, my thing is technology trajectories, right? By the time you prove that, we're 10 years on, probably, from where we are now. If you invested that same, so let's go for the hypothecation model. So there's someone who keeps, pointing out that we could maybe ring fence the profits and use it to do it.
John Baldwin, is that right?
Yeah, and use it to do energy efficiency.
He wants to have two companies, one that fracks and the other one that takes a special sort of dividend or a special royalty from that and uses it to reduce gas demand. And there's some elegance to that solution.
Yeah, there is some elegance to it. And I've got a lot more time for John. John is not in the category of people that are just like screaming about production without knowing about gas, right? He's knowledgeable, and it's not a terrible idea in many ways. But my sense is, if you look across the range of technologies that I look across and the markets I look across, by the time John has got his gas out of the ground with his first company and hit the volumes that he needs to make it profitable and interesting, to do something with his second company on energy efficiency and insulation, you could have spent these 10 years doing energy efficiency and insulation. And the reason would just simply be, at a macroeconomic level, it makes sense for our buildings to be more energy efficient in the UK. You get the savings back from literally the government funding it without having to need a shale industry to do it. So just crack on with the green measures. That's it.
Right, but when you say crack on with the green measures, then there's another sort of body of people on Twitter, very vocal, who sort of say the solution to Ukraine and the price spike is wind, or it's wind and solar. And frankly, even if it's efficiency and heat pumps, I mean, how long is that going to take?
Yeah.
We started off by talking about 2040. And I think, there's no question we could have largely solved the problem by then if we were really, in this country, we went from no central heating to everybody having central heating over about a 20-year period around the 70s. But there is, those who are arguing for clean solutions seem to be saying, well, let's just leave the energy prices high for the next 5, 10, 15 years until we've solved the problem.
Yeah.
And is that what a just transition looks like?
No, also that, right? So I have strong views on technologies because I've got a background as a climate campaigner, but that's sort of irrelevant for my job as Energy UK. When I'm thinking about things like increased gas production, it is in the context of keeping people's bills as low as possible, making sure that the UK economy isn't totally ruined by what we're seeing on the global gas market and by missing out on the opportunities of a technology transition, and then also climate change. And so I think you're right. I think renewables is the long-term answer. That is so obvious for everyone. It's why the Secretary of State is repeating it. We pursue net zero as fast as possible. That is very, very clearly the way that we reduce our gas dependence. You do big renewables and offshore wind in the UK and interconnection and kind of all the big kit stuff, but you also do demand reduction, and you do that largely over the next 10 to 20 years. That is very clear. What is not clear is how do we get through the next year, 2 years, however long there is this disruption in the gas markets, and how do we transition gas in the UK? Because you're right, actually in the UK system, we think we're going to need a bit of a mix, nuclear and renewables, and a bit of unabated and abated gas. Those are real market challenges, they're real affordability challenges, and now we also need to find some extra help for people like right now. That's much less easy than the long term. And the renewables folks are thinking long term because it takes 10 years to build a wind farm, but there's the stuff of right now. That's the stuff that's worrying me.
Right. And when you say it takes 10 years to build a wind farm, we also need to remember that although globally
should take one, I should say, that's a lot of that is government stuff, but it does currently take 8 to 10.
Right. And even if it takes only a year or two to build a solar farm, right, and so we can do things fast with renewables. But I don't know the figures for the UK. You might well know them. But globally, wind and solar are 14% of electricity supply, but electricity is only 20% of energy use, total energy use, because you've got industry, heating, we've talked a lot about, and transport. And we've got transport. And so right now, actually, wind and solar, after an incredible 20-year run, which I never forecast, I didn't think that the sectors I was sort of aligning with would be as successful as they've been when I started New Energy Finance, because that's what we were doing, a lot of wind and solar analysis. But 14% of 20% is 2.8%. So, my view, and I'm an engineer, I look at the supply chains that are needed, the planning consents, all of the things that are needed, the interconnections, the new technologies to manage variability. None of it's impossible. But the idea that we would go from that sort of 2.8% of energy needs to 70%, within 5 years, because we want to, because of climate and because of Ukraine, and because we're finally going to sort of break the stranglehold of the fossil mafia and whatever. We're not going to do it in 5 years. We're going to do it in 25, 35, 45 years is the honest answer, surely.
So the thing that I used to say often to my good friends in the climate movement, look, cards on the table, we should have moved earlier. We should go faster. Not enough. Frightens the hell out of me. However, this is about a massive economic shift, and for tackling climate change, you've basically got two routes. Either genuinely think that 8 billion people are going to really curtail their lifestyles or stop being humans on Instagram, buying the next stupidly large car because that's what they marketed to them. You have to either think that you can kind of change the behavior of 8 billion people and rewire the global economy in 10 years. So collapse capitalism and find some other model, or you have to lean into a lot of climate mitigation being about technology change and economy change. And therefore you have to lean into how long that takes. And I can, as if I do, my members can only build a wind farm so fast. They can only turn off coal as fast as they've got public permission to do it, because they don't want the lights to go out. If the lights go out ever in any of these markets, the first thing that will happen is people point the finger at renewables. When bills are high, they've got to balance, the moral imperative to get bills down for an essential public service versus the moral imperative to tackle climate change. It's actually the reason I took the Energy UK job, is to wrestle with those complexities. And just the final thought on this, many of the really big barriers to that transition are now non-market. They are, there's some market stuff that will happen as a consequence of the technology shift. But there are things like planning, consenting, grid connection, the sheer flipping physics of trying to get everything changing in the right order. They are not things that are easy to solve, and they're complex system interactions. And so again, another reason I took the job was just trying to move those chess pieces around. Intellectually, it's fascinating. On an emotional level, it's often really, really, really frightening, but
So I think anytime anybody on my Twitter threads or LinkedIn sort of intimates that we should just do XYZ because it's simple and obvious, I think I'm going to end up providing a link to this episode of Cleaning Up, because it just isn't. It's just very it's
really difficult whole system thinking. Yeah.
I think that one thing that I would suggest is changing because of the energy price spike and because of Ukraine is that certainly for me, the emphasis on affordability is much more front and center than it has been in my work over the past, let's call it 15, 20 years. It's just, if we can't do this whilst keeping energy affordable, the social costs, not the economic costs, of course, but the social costs will be enormous. And also the pushback, because all that will happen is that there's this kind of fertile territory for all sorts of people to step in and say, all that people care about is energy bills, and they can push whatever crackpot solutions they want. And it will be very fertile. They will be very successful, is my worry.
Yeah. So we actually just this week are having an organised campaign against our net zero target from a very small group of folks who've done it before. So it's like, this is what I'm saying to journalists, because they're writing to me and asking what I think of it as a new campaign. I'm like, it's not a new campaign. It's every single time the energy price spikes or energy bills are going to go up, the same group of people roll out the same playbook, because they expect the public to walk away from climate action when bills go up. I don't know whether in this particular instance that playbook works, because it's so obviously about gas. And I think on a common sense level, for the first time, the public might see gas as not the best thing for energy security, as opposed to the thing for energy security and low bills. But nevertheless, of course we worry about that. And I think the affordability question, actually, the distributional impacts of the transition are, I think, one of the biggest things we have to get right. So not affordability overall, because the economics are clear. Net zero is a good way to go. The distributional impacts of paying for it and when.
Right. And, let's be explicit though about these people who are, organizing their campaign. I mean, this is the Global Warming Policy Foundation.
Yes, I'm in trouble. I'm in trouble for tweeting about it.
They've now, morphed into this thing called Net Zero Watch.
Yeah.
And the most recent thing was Nigel Farage has decided that we have to have a referendum on net zero because it's not enough.
It's the originality of thought I like best.
Well, actually, I want to come back to the question of how seriously we should take threats, right?
Yeah.
Because I do think that mockery is a good defense against certain sorts. I think if President Trump, when he was if candidate Trump had been mocked and laughed at, we maybe wouldn't be quite where we are, or the US
I completely agree.
Gone for him, instead of taking his every utterance seriously and analyzing it as though it had any truth value or value as a conceptual value. But the so you've got Nigel Farage that wants to have a referendum on net zero because, according to him, there's no democratic mandate. I mean, the fact that the Conservatives stood on that as a massive central
manifesto
in 2019 strikes me as being quite a good democratic mandate. But I guess, I suppose the question is how seriously we should take him. And you very publicly on Twitter sort of didn't, right? Do you want to, shall I read the tweet or do you want to?
I mean, I had to explain this to my press office this morning. Right, so just before you do, the theory of change on this is exactly the one that you're describing. I think that people take what is a very small group of cranks, like relative to where both the UK population is, and our parliamentarians as a whole are. Oh, actually, and also lastly, the energy industry is. And they write reams and reams of articles about them that can kind of self-perpetuate into a movement. So I just thought, I'm just going to not write a serious tweet.
Right. So what you wrote, and this is about Nigel Farage's call for a referendum, was not seen a cry for attention this desperate since my toddler put a pair of my husband's boxer shorts on her head last week and shouted, "Look at my hat."
I mean, it's very...
So yes. This is referendum on net zero as boxer shorts on head moment for Mr. Farage.
Yeah, it feels that silly. I mean, it just.
But let me challenge you on that. And I actually
go on.
I'm going to challenge you because I think it's worth exploring, not because I disagree. I think the idea of mockery as a political tool is underused, as I've already said. But when you say that these are cranks and nobody takes it, they're a small minority, but that is, and it's known that I was a Brexit voter. I am still to this day a Brexiter. So people were saying the exact same things about Brexit.
Oh, no one sensible was saying that about Brexit, though. No, and not at the beginning.
What you said, there was a small group of people. They were called cranks. We were called cranks. People said, "Oh, the banking industry realizes how absurd." So the industry was, said it was ridiculous, etc., etc. And you say it's the same playbook. And my own, on this one, I think that they are. I don't think the word is cranks. I tell you why not. For me, the issue is that this question of energy bills is absolutely central. And when you call them cranks, what they're doing is they're mining a very real social problem. And when you marginalize them, I think it's incumbent on you, particularly in your role, but also me as a commentator, to really take this question of energy affordability seriously, put it at the heart of what we do.
But I think it's about exposing the fact that they're not on the side of the common man. So coming back to, so I thought about this as well before actually I decided to kind of step up on engaging with them, because there is a choice just to ignore it. Plenty of people in my sort of role would, and there is an argument that is sort of not my core responsibility. But there's a real risk to the industry and to investment if they are successful, and they were in 2015. So I think there's a reason to take them, what's that expression, literally not seriously. So I'm not underestimating
seriously not literally.
Seriously not literally going around. So here's what I think. I don't think it's like Brexit, because firstly, when you poll people on the question of Europe and the UK, there wasn't a clear democratic mandate for it, either in opinion polls or in manifestos. It was always a question of uncertainty. Secondly, most smart people, before it became a really entrenched political debate, especially back at the start of the referendum debate in the UK, wasn't always that happy with the EU. And there were very good reasons for, certainly some policy changes, certainly, a more complex discussion about trade and the economy than we ended up having. So I don't think it's the same. Whereas on net zero, it's most of the analysis tends in the same direction. It's very, very obvious what the correct answers. And this feels a little bit like they've underestimated that bit. I think the risk is, for me and for anyone in industry, we cannot be glib about the fact that ordinary people do not understand where their energy comes from, why it's the price it is, what's causing the price hikes, and nor can we be feckless and incompassionate about the fact that we have to pay for this somehow, and those costs need to fall fairly and justly on people. And a lot of the time, the strongest proponents for climate action are middle class or thoughtless about costs, or dismiss concerns about costs as being cranky. Now, I think this group of guys, because it is mostly guys, are being horribly disingenuous. And one of the things I dislike most about it is that they seem to be self-interested. It seems to be an exercise not in worrying about affordability of net zero, but political power. For me, affordability of net zero is a central question. Taking down a group of people who would prevent the growth of the economy, affordability of bills in the long run, you know, a valuable economic transition for their own short-term political ends is important, but I shouldn't let go of the affordability question. We should own that. That was a really rambly answer, but it's, yeah.
Emma, that was a brilliant answer. That was a brilliant answer and was the right answer. And I think that that's exactly right. I'm somebody who has spent the better part of 20 years explaining that we can have a high performing, low cost, resilient, clean energy system. That is the goal. And that has to remain front and center of our vision, however, I guess what I've said is that I think for me, we've got to think much more about how we protect energy prices along the way, because these are, whether serious, not literal, and so on, the opposition is tapping into a real issue. And I got into trouble with a tweet that I sent out last week saying that, it was a sort of message to activists.
Oh, I saw that, I think.
If the A to Z of what you're doing is making it hard to invest in fossil. And I was thinking about people who are, every pipeline has to be blocked, fracking has to be blocked, every element of, maintaining the output from oil fields by investment, making it impossible for Shell to even maintain a headquarters in Holland. That's all good stuff. But if that's all you have in mind and all you celebrate, then expect a price spike and expect Mr. Putin to have more power. And of course, people got outraged and said, you're blaming the activists. I'm saying they have some responsibility, and we all have a responsibility to think about this affordability question.
Yeah, and I actually, this is an activist point as well. I think there's sometimes, I think Extinction Rebellion and others, I come from the environmental movement, I've done my fair share of activism, been to my fair share of protests. I think it's incredibly valuable for moving the Overton window, which we talk about a lot. The UK has a net zero target, partly because the original Extinction Rebellion protests were really well received, really well done, very broad, brought in a section of the public they don't normally get. And they kind of created this political window for action. That's really good protest, working really well. And activism is important, and I will fight to protect it. However, having come from an NGO where we balance campaigning and then things like technical expertise, there's often a bit of a gap, because the technical answers to the question are often more tedious and more complex than the ones you can campaign on. So to just give you an example, we spent a lot of time trying to convince the brilliant campaigns team at WWF to focus on energy efficiency and loft insulation rather than wind turbines, because heat in the UK is a massive issue. Wind turbines at that point were less so, and we wanted to try and see if these brilliant campaigning minds could be creative about the boring stuff as well as the really sexy stuff that they can fairly easily bring the public with them on or get a media hit on. And I'd love to see more of that in activism.
And of course, what we got was Insulate Britain, which of course was probably a response to that exact.
Maybe it was my fault.
Your fault. But of course, what's fascinating there is that they want to talk about Insulate Britain, but I'll bet you that most of them have probably not insulated. They've certainly not moved to heat pumps, because we know the numbers. So the number of people protesting is much bigger than the number of people with heat pumps. And they I guarantee you, they haven't looked at their flow temperature of their boilers. So what you've got is a bunch of people who have not taken basic actions themselves, and they are generally middle class and perfectly able to, either them or their parents, do those things. But what they really want to do is to try to bring down capitalism or do some other things, and not really be serious about a solution set. And when they talk solutions, it's always, oh, we've campaigned for solar on the roofs. You're not, you know this, you're not going to heat the UK by putting solar panels on your roof. There is no sun in winter to do that. The output is just not there. And so, you know, what I love, by the way, by the time this comes out, the week before, so the episode that will come out the week before you is Rhiannon Marie Thomas.
Oh, who's great. It's just this is just a list of people I think are great.
And what I love about the conversation with her and about her approach to what she's doing is she's working on the solutions. So sustainable finance, largely, as I see it, is about stopping people from doing things, making it harder, increasing the cost of capital for fossil. What she's doing is down there with the hood up in the engine compartment, trying to figure out how to finance clean heat and clean
transportation. We've had conversations about doing stuff together for that reason, because the energy industry, I mean, this is probably a spoiler alert. I don't know whether Rhiannon and I will find time to pull it off, but we were talking about exactly that. You know, you need to find a financing model for energy efficiency, maybe, you know, that. And so one of the problems is a lack of, you know, access to green finance for people. That's a very basic one, like green mortgages and things like that. But up the chain, some of the things I talked about as being a problem for, say, the 40 gigawatts of offshore wind are stuff like being able to do really imaginative things for communities who are going to be hosting our substations, which is basically a finance decision. It's the investors saying, all right, we'll take slightly less margin in return for you to be able to spend the money in this bit, in this place in the economy that's going to take the infrastructure burden. You know, there's some really interesting trade-offs, and it comes back to your point again about where the distributional impacts about how we reward people for taking on these technologies, and acknowledging that for some people they're going to lose some stuff to gain some stuff. So yeah, she and we talked about doing some work. Yeah. So
you know, that's opening up a couple of really important things we won't have time to deal with fully. One of them you just mentioned, which is kind of place-based solutions where communities solve things. I'm going to have to not go down that rabbit hole right now, or we'll be here for another hour. But the other one on financing of energy efficiency, we had an amazing, extraordinary expert, Peter Sweetman. I think he was just before Christmas, if I'm not wrong. We can put a link into the show notes.
Yeah.
But he is really the kind of encyclopedically knowledgeable person on energy efficiency investment. So he was on cleaning up. I want to finish though, if we could not, unless you want to comment on anything else on.
No, I really want to go down a centralized or decentralized energy systems rabbit hole, but let's maybe not, because we would be here for an hour.
We would, well, maybe we'll find a time to bring you back to talk about that, particularly if you've worked with Rhiannon Marie, then maybe we'll do something creative and get both of you on. But I wanted to finish by talking about one other thing, which is that you actually had your first child whilst you were already CEO of Energy UK. Is that correct? And
well, it's sort of. I interviewed for this job when she was 3 weeks old, and I'm pregnant again now. So yeah, so they had they had a decision to make about hiring someone who was on maternity leave, who wanted to work maternity leave. Yeah. So
I recall now that you were on maternity leave whilst you did the interview for the role. Is that right?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
And I've had quite a few women leaders on cleaning up. I'm proud to say we're at about 40%. Could be higher.
Good work.
We're somewhere around that. And we're actually recording this just one day before International Women's Day. And in fact, by the time this episode comes out, the last 4 episodes will have been women. So that's great. But most of them are not, many of them have got children, but they're a bit older than yours. What is it like to be a younger woman, a woman who's actively, you've got a toddler, and now you're presumably going to take a bit more maternity leave, or maybe not, but you're right in that process. What is that like? Are you finding the industry supportive? Is social media supportive? Are people being helped? Is it just irrelevant, which it should in a sense be?
No, it's highly relevant, which is what anyone would say to you if they're doing things differently, right? The point about all the initiatives on diversity and inclusion is acknowledging that if you're coming from a non-stereotypical experience, you tend to bring that to your work, whether you like it or not. And in my case, it's been a real car crash of both logistics and identity, getting used to being a mother at the same time as taking on the biggest job I've had. I haven't done a chief exec role before. I'll tell you that my husband actually took a different job after I was appointed to this one, on the basis that we thought I'd probably get fired quite quickly doing it all. And he's finally able to kind of think about what he wants to do, because it doesn't look like I am going to get fired, unless that tweet about Farage really gets me into trouble. What I think about it is this: it is a car crash, and that should be okay. So I think, since having a child, it is astonishing how many of the bosses of the industry before, who tend, not wholly, but usually to be, middle-aged blokes with slightly grown-up children, for whom my young children are a lightning rod to talk about what they missed and how they wish they'd been able to have a bit more balance, or how a lot of them used to go sleep in their car at lunchtime. And it's not that my tiredness, forgetfulness, occasional incompetence at my role is new to any parent in the workplace. It's just, it's visible because my baby has been literally on me for many of those meetings, and a much more visible part of what I do. So I've just decided to not hide her, but I don't think that's unhealthy. I think we need to find a new model of leadership that acknowledges a richer take on what we bring to these roles. On Twitter, it is an issue for a lot of people, and for that reason I talk about her. I never use her name, because I actually get quite a lot of hate mail about my family or my husband or my child. In fact, she's just coming down the stairs, you might be able to hear her. And for that reason, I think it's really important to be visible and to stand up for that sort of ability to do both roles. Can you hear her? Absolutely.
It's fantastic. She has fantastic timing.
She might come in and say hello, because she's quite miserable that she's not being allowed to see mummy. So I don't know. I've got mixed feelings about it. I think everyone should be allowed to be private about their family life if they want, if that makes it easier to do the role. For me, I partly took the job because I was terrified once I had children, no one would offer me a CEO role before, because I knew that I would want to work slightly differently and be slightly different as a mum. I didn't want to compromise. And because it's so visible when you have children as a woman relative to having them as a man still, and women still do most of the caregiving. And so I think it's really important to show women and men coming up behind me that you can have a family and do these jobs, and it might mean you're slightly less good at your job sometimes, but that's okay.
So there's only one thing, again, it's a brilliant answer. There's only one thing that I would push back on, which is your characterization of it as a car crash or being less good at your job or whatever, because I just wonder that you may be setting the bar too high. There are plenty of times when I have messed up, nothing to do with the fact that I've got young children. And I think if anybody watching or listening to this says, well, gosh, she's incredibly good, but imagine how much better she would be if she didn't have kids, I think they need to look at themselves in the mirror and ask whether they, I don't know. I suppose I'm challenging whether you aren't being too harsh on yourself, but anybody looking at this with the same point of view, I think they're being too harsh. I think that's absurd. We're none of us are perfect.
I think that's right, but I think there's been a real change in corporate culture acknowledging that you don't have to be perfect, right? So I talk about children because that's been the thing that's really distracted me from my job a lot of the time. But for people, it's other things. So no one's perfect, and even if that's not true, you do screw up sometimes. I think the reason I talk about that is one of the things that I often hear, particularly from women or from people who come from diverse backgrounds, is they wait until they feel perfect at something to do the job, or they don't feel qualified, or they don't feel ready. And I think exposing that actually you can do these jobs and not be on top of them, or to acknowledge that, yes, having children has changed my priorities, actually is enabling. And there was a whole trend of feminism when I was in my early 20s about leaning in, like do more than the guys, go further than your predecessors, work harder, be fitter, be stronger, be smarter. I want to have as much chance as getting promoted as the average mediocre bloke sat next to me. That's what I want. That's what true inclusion is.
Also, yeah, and I think, with all of us, we're all allowed to screw up as long as we don't screw up in such a major way that we don't deliver the main deliverables of our jobs. And you're absolutely right. A lot of guys, myself included, we just never got the imposter syndrome module installed. And that's the main difference. We're just as imposterish as any woman or as most guys, but just some of us never kind of see it in that way. We just don't know. What can I do? I apologize. But
you don't have to.
I think anybody listening to this is going to conclude that you are doing a fantastic job. I'd like to really just thank you for the time you spent with me here today on cleaning up. And I suspect this is going to be a very popular episode. So thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. And not sorry for the wailing toddler in the background, I suppose.
It's perfectly on message. I don't know how we organized it, but it was spot on.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye. So that was Emma Pinchbeck, Chief Executive of Energy UK. My guest next week on Cleaning Up is Tom Steyer. He's the co-executive chair of Galvanized Climate Solutions. And in 2020, he sought the Democratic nomination to run for President of the United States. Please join me at this time next week for a conversation with Tom Steyer. Cleaning Up is brought to you by the Liebreich Foundation and the Gilardini Foundation.